Yeah, that's easy that you can have that available to you. You might suggest that to a client, but I agree, Kurt. I think if I have that as an agent and I pull that up, I'm gonna scare the bejesus out of my clients and just
Scare the bejesus out of you.
Right, yeah, I'm sure, yeah. So that's what I'm saying. I don't wanna look it up around my house either, because you don't wanna know. I hate to say that, but it's not for an agent to have to disclose. It's for a seller to disclose if they are aware of it. If you as an agent are aware of it and you wanna share that with your client, great. But we are not required to share that about sexual predators or offenders in an area. And so I would say I wouldn't want the app on my phone, or if I have it, I'm not sharing it with my clients because I don't want to be that person that can never sell a house because they don't want it. Yes.
So if the agent disclosed it to the seller and the seller didn't know before they disclosed it, but they know now, do they have to?
Well, it's not for the seller to disclose. That's the thing is, if a seller gets a postcard from the sheriff's office, from my understanding, that means that a sexual offender or predator is like within a few houses of that location, or they are such a severe predator of whatever they got, because there's levels of predators. If you go on the website, there are different levels of what they've actually been caught doing, and whether it's a felony or whatever it is. And so therefore, if a postcard is received, then a seller has to disclose that. But if the seller doesn't receive anything from the sheriff's office, it is not their duty to disclose to a buyer or the real estate agent's duty to disclose it. It is public record and information. The buyer should get on the website for the sheriff's department in that county, and they can look up the information. Yep. And then confidentiality. One of the common misconceptions that we see a lot is that a buyer seems to think, or a buyer's agent seems to think, that if I write an offer on a property and I send it to the listing agent, that the listing agent and seller have to keep that offer confidential. They do not. A seller, once they receive your offer, could instruct their agent to go on Facebook and say, we have a $200,000 offer. Anybody that can beat that offer, please submit a bid immediately, or whatever the case is, they can shop the offer. So that's the biggest thing to understand is you have to keep everything confidential with your client as the seller. However, the buyer's agent, once they submit an offer, nothing is confidential there. And it also, sometimes a seller might be going through a divorce or whatever the situation. I can think of one, actually. We had a seller that she was trying to get away from a spouse, and she had a restraining order against the spouse, and she had her house up for sale, but she didn't want the neighbors to necessarily know. Now, ultimately, they were probably going to find out, but she didn't want a sign in the yard, and she didn't want us publicly marketing the property with a sign or online, because she did not want the spouse to know where she was relocating, that the house was for sale, that she was moving, and she didn't want the neighbors to necessarily know. So that's a confidential situation where, talk to your sellers. Is there a reason that they don't want their property in the MLS? Is there something, maybe they're going through a divorce and they don't want anybody to know that, simply because oftentimes buyers will think, oh, they're going through a divorce, I can get this house for a better deal because they don't like each other and they want to get out of it, right? So anything that your seller instructs you to keep confidential, you need to make sure that you are keeping it confidential. And then excluded fixtures, if, let's say grandma's chandelier is hanging in the dining room and you want to make sure that that's excluded, then you would write in here that that's an excluded fixture. You're also going to want to make sure that it is in the MLS and it is in the purchase agreement. Most importantly, just because you put an excluded fixture in the listing agreement and on the MLS does not mean it is going to remain excluded if you don't also exclude it on the purchase agreement. Because the purchase agreement, anything can be negotiated in or out. And then a home warranty, that block is there if the seller is going to offer a home warranty, what the home warranty company name is, and the cost of the home warranty. Point of sale inspections, we don't really follow this rule, but if you read this, it does say that if the county requires a point of sale inspection, which Stark County does for a septic system, the seller shall apply for the inspection at the seller's expense. Now, we don't often see that happen. Okay, oftentimes a buyer is willing to pay for a septic inspection or a well inspection if they're VA. But our listing agreement actually says that the seller is going to pay for it and they are going to submit for that inspection. So you need to go over this with your seller, because if the seller says, I'm not paying for the inspection, then you're going to need to cross that out. Okay. And then the seller obligations, it just says that the seller shall maintain the sole responsibility and liability for the property. Why is that so darn important? It is so darn important because we have seen, especially in this weather, furnaces go out, water tanks have gone out, we have seen flooded basements because pipes have burst. We have seen ice dams on properties. Just because a property is vacant and a seller's not there does not mean it's the agent's responsibility to maintain the integrity of the property or maintenance of the property. Okay. And then the cybersecurity, it just says that, we will never ask anybody for their credit card information, debit card information, banking accounts, anything like that. We should never be giving wire instructions. So it's just letting them know if it looks like it came from us, it didn't, that we are not ever going to ask for that information. And then this is a binding agreement for real estate services only. The word only, again, is underlined and it's in bold simply because, again, sellers oftentimes think that we are responsible, or neighbors think, oh my gosh, the grass is 3 miles high. You should be responsible for cutting that grass, or why aren't you doing something? I can't believe that you would list a house and do it. We're not responsible for any of those things. Surveys, accounting, inspections, none of that. We are only responsible for the real estate services. And then you would always get your seller signatures on the purchase or on the listing agreement. Fill out their address. If their address is not the property address, always a good idea. And then their contact number has also been added there if you want to add a phone number for them. One of the things that I will tell you is it takes 1 to buy and 2 to sell. I get this question a lot where you have a spouse or a person that's married and they say, I'm the only person on the deed. I'm the only person on the mortgage and on the deed. I own this house prior to me getting married and my spouse is not signing anything. Well, legally, they don't have to sign the listing agreement or the purchase agreement. But what can happen is a seller's spouse could show up to closing and say, I'm not signing these documents. I didn't agree to list the property for sale. I didn't agree to sell the property. I didn't agree to that price of the property. And that will stop the sale because we have dower rights in the state of Ohio. So Arkansas, Kentucky, and Ohio, there are 3 states that are left with dower rights. So it's always my recommendation to get your seller, if they're married, to get their signature on the listing agreement and purchase agreement, always. Don't forget that we have same-sex marriage. Just because there's a man that doesn't wear a wedding ring or a woman that doesn't wear a wedding ring, or you don't see family photos or whatever, never assume that somebody is not married or doesn't have a spouse. Yes.
I have a situation that I'm working on right now. I was talking to Gina about it earlier. Married couple, divorced 11 years ago. He had to maintain a residence for the child and his ex-wife. When the child turns 18 years old and graduates from high school, he can sell the house, which is literally months away.
Mhm.
Kid's already 18. And he has approached me about selling the property.
Yep.
How's it gonna work in that situation? I pulled up the tax form, they're both on the tax form.
If they are both on, well, so the tax form, I would think has been updated because of the deed. Perhaps not. I won't guarantee that. What I would suggest is in that case, in order to identify who the owners are, ask the title company to pull a tax and legal on the property. It will identify who are the owners of the property. Even if they're divorced, if they are both owners of the property, you will need both of their signatures. And if either party is remarried, you will need the spouse's signature because of dowry rights.
Okay,
So if they got divorced 10 years ago, but the husband had to maintain a place for the missus and the child, he may have been remarried by now.
he is.
Okay, so then it's not going to be a comfortable situation for any of the parties involved. However, the new missus has to sign the listing agreement and the purchase agreement and at closing because of dowry rights.
So 3 signatures.
So you're going to have 3 signatures. You're going to have the Mr. and Mrs. and you're going to have the old Mrs. on there too. And the old Mrs. is probably not going to be real happy that the new Mrs. is signing on a house that she's lived in and maintained for all these years, especially because the new person, the new Mrs. is going to see or allowed to see all of the settlement statement and know what's going on with the transaction. And it really puts you as the real estate agent in a rough situation because you have a duty to the new Mrs. and the Mr. and the old Mrs.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
always fun. Yep. All right, and then you always want to make sure that you guys are signing the listing agreement. If you have a team, so for example, if again, as I go back, if Ashley and I are on a team and we are co-listing agents, then we both need to be signing the listing agreement. Okay. What I can tell you as a kind of behind the scenes that I've seen some of the teams do is they make a template of our listing agreement where the main listing agent has always signed it. They just sign it and then the co-listing agent signs it whenever they actually take the listing. So that way, the main listing agent, even though they may not be listing the property, if they have to be on it, it's always signed. So it's just a way to do it easily. Any questions on the listing agreement that we went over? Okay, so then I am going to go on to the exclusive right to lease agreement. For the very longest time, I did not have our exclusive right to lease agreement or our rental lease agreement in Dotloop. And the reason for that is because most agents are not familiar with what it takes to lease a property. And I'm going to scare you a little bit and hope you don't lease properties if you don't know what you're doing. The reason I say that is because we are always learning. I just learned something new. Unfortunately, it came with a complaint. The complaint is not against me, but it is against Keller Williams Legacy Group. We had an agent who started to engage in leasing properties. They listed a property in the city of Akron for lease. A person called and asked if the landlord would accept Section 8. Agent answered, the seller is not set up, or the owner is not set up to accept Section 8. You could apply, however, there is a $25 application fee, and I feel that it would be a waste of your time to apply because the seller is not set up to accept Section 8 and they would have to go through the inspection process. I don't think that's a bad answer. I think the agent was being very kind in giving this potential tenant a heads up that we don't want to take your $25, right? Well, that particular prospective tenant, decided that that was not an acceptable answer and that basically they were being denied the ability to rent this particular property because the seller would not accept Section 8. We now have a complaint from the Akron Civil Service Commission saying that we are in violation of Fair Housing Code in the city of Akron. Akron City, Cincinnati, and Toledo all have an additional protected class, which is source of income, meaning that a seller or a landlord, actually in this case, I apologize, a landlord cannot discriminate against a tenant for their source of income, meaning that if their source of income to pay the rent is Section 8, a landlord cannot deny them that right to complete an application and deny them solely or even partially based on the fact that their income is a housing voucher from Section 8. And so the landlord could allow the person to apply if they wanted to. They would charge them the $25 application fee, and then they could deny them because maybe their credit score isn't applicable. Maybe their income level is not applicable, meaning that they have to make 3 times the amount of the rent, if that's the standard for that landlord. We don't get to make those decisions as the listing company, right? We are not ever allowed to discriminate for any reason, nor should we be. A seller also and a landlord cannot if it's a protected class. So I go a little bit further with this example to say, if the agent, which now we know the right answer to that prospective tenant should have been, if you would like to fill out an application, here's the application, this is the application fee. They should have let them fill out the application and charge them the $25. Even though we think that's doing a disservice to this potential tenant, that's what they legally should have done and we wouldn't have a complaint. This, in 24 years of me being licensed, this is the first fair housing complaint that I have ever been a part of as far as for the brokerage or myself. And I don't know what to expect. I will say that we had to turn it into our E&O insurance because we have a $5,000 deductible and our attorney has basically said, listen, There's going to be discovery. We have to know whether or not this allegation is legitimate. Was there a phone call? Is it in writing? Was it recorded? Was it a tester from the Division of Real Estate? Was it a tester from Akron City? We don't know. So there's a lot of things going on here that we are unaware of. So I say that to you to scare you a little bit, to say, if you don't know what you're doing in a real estate transaction, you shouldn't be doing it. Just because you want the commission does not mean that you should be taking a listing, working with a buyer, or listing a property for lease. Okay. So our exclusive right to lease, I have added in there reluctantly, because we do have a lot of agents that know what they're doing and they are competent in this field. And so therefore, I don't want to harm their business. We allow them to lease a property. We'll go over this document, and if you have questions, again, ask. This document is what I mean, it's kind of long, 5 pages. All right, so we've got 5 pages here, and this is the only version of it. There is not a version that's larger printed. All right, so the appointment of the realtor, this is saying that the landlord is appointing Keller Williams Legacy Group Realty, the broker, and whatever the real estate is. So you're going to put that on line 4, the address of the property that you are leasing. You're going to be advertising, and this listing agreement or exclusive right to lease is a little bit different. This says that you have 12 months or until midnight on the blank day of blank. It starts the date that they sign it. That's the start date of this agreement. There is not an actual start date that you would type in like you do with our listing agreement. It starts right away. All right. So for 12 months or until midnight on however many days, you could say 30 days, 45 days of whatever, and then put the expiration date. All right. And then rental rates, you've got to talk to the landlord about this and figure out, are you charging more? You know, maybe you have a seller that has a 3-bedroom duplex and a 2-bedroom duplex, and it's the same property. Maybe one side has 3, one side has 2. So that's what line 11 is for, is to say the landlord is going to charge blank for the 3-bedroom, blank for a 2-bedroom, blank for a 1-bedroom. Is it a loft? Whichever it is. Are they going to allow pets? Is there a maximum number of pets that a tenant can have? Is there an additional cost per animal per month? If there are more than what the maximum number of animals rather that they can have, you would put in there. Animals can include turtles, it can include cats, dogs, birds, you know, whatever. So talk to the landlord to understand what pets they are allowed or not allowed. The other thing I will say here is this can get you into trouble with pets too, because we live in a society where you can go online now and almost any animal can be registered as a emotional support animal. I am not as well versed in this aspect as I should be, most likely, but I will say I know enough to be dangerous to say this. Our attorney has said that there is a difference between a legitimate certificate of a animal that's for your benefit, your health benefits, versus not. The certificate that you can go online for and register any animal is not legitimate. You can get it, and sometimes landlords might be scared not to accept it. But if you actually have an emotional support animal, there's typically doctor documentation that you can request and a certificate from a physician or somebody that says that they are required to have or recommend that they can have. Now, I say that to you because if you're not well versed, I know I'm not listing any properties for lease unless it's my own. And in those cases, if I needed to, I would contact legal counsel to find out if somebody asked me about having an emotional support animal. But you don't want to answer a question if you don't know the answer. So if you are not well versed in leasing properties with emotional support animals, be very careful. Let's get you educated on it before you start leasing properties out. And then, is there a garage? If so, how much is it per month? Or is there a parking spot? How much is it per month, etc. Line 16 through 19 just say that, you know, the rent shall include all of the following if you are including it. So does the landlord pay the heat? Does the landlord pay water, gas, electric, trash pickup, whatever that case would be? And are they supplying a microwave, refrigerator, dishwasher? Maybe they're not supplying any of those things, so you wouldn't check any of those boxes, or maybe they're supplying all of it, so you would check all those boxes. It depends on what they're supplying. And then the tenant shall pay for the following on line 20 through 22. What are they paying for? Are they paying for the heat, gas, water, electric, or anything else? You would list it there. And then the terms of the lease is for 1 year unless otherwise agreed to by the landlord. Okay, so if you want an 18-month lease, then when your landlord gives you a lease agreement that they write, it might say 18 months. So if that's the case, you would cross out the 1 year, but unless it's otherwise agreed to with the landlord, it is automatically 1 year, and we have that pre-typed in there for you. Delegation, like in many of our documents, lines 25 through 26, the broker may appoint another licensee within the brokerage to represent the landlord's interest, and the broker shall notify the landlord of any such appointment. The reason that's in there is because, again, there are some times where an agent might leave the brokerage perhaps, and I am allowed to then, because all the listings belong to the brokerage, I can then assign that listing to somebody else within the brokerage. Or let's say the landlord no longer wants to work with the agent that they're working with. That allows us to go ahead and redesignate a different agent within the brokerage. And then realtor acceptance, the broker accepts the employment and agrees, basically, we are agreeing to be hired in consideration of agreements by the landlord to use its best efforts to procure a tenant for the real estate. Certification of ownership, the landlord warrants that they own the real property and any personal property which is to be rented for the tenant pursuant to the lease. So it's just a disclosure. And then lines 32 through 38, you're going to have check boxes, or you can have the client initial, and this is the landlord client. Is the property located in a historic district? It is or it is not. Is it located in a floodplain? Is it subject to a homeowners association or any other association? And is it subject to a maintenance agreement? It is or it is not. All right. Lead-based paint, it is important that any property that is built prior to 1978 that may contain lead-based paint, even if you're leasing a property, you have to have a lead-based paint disclosure. It's the same disclosure whether you're buying, selling, leasing, or purchasing, but it's the same disclosure.
Look at your ball. Look at your ball over there.
And then lines 50 through 55, if there is a homeowners association, landlord will provide those documents and any applicable restrictions to us so that we can provide them to the tenant. And then lines 56 through 59, again, just says what Ohio state law recommends or requires rather us to put in there as far as commissions go. And lines 60 through 77, this is what we are going to get paid as the brokerage. So it would be the commission shall be payable when a binding lease has been executed to lease the real estate pursuant to the terms of the agreement, and the sum of blank. So that would be on line 64, whichever is greater, which it would be, you could put a percent in there, or you could put a dollar amount, whichever you prefer. We have the dollar amount, and typically that's what you're going to see because rents can fluctuate. All right, and then should say any renewal or expansion of the lease, then that means on the 12th month, basically that we could get paid that renewal if that tenant stays in the property. Now, you may enforce that, you may not enforce that, it's up to you. The landlord may say, no, I'm not allowing you to enforce that. It's a one and done. If I renew this tenant, I'm not paying you anything. That's possible. And it would be, you could do the percentage on line 69 if that's where you wanted, if we, 1/12 or the percentage of the rent. And then the landlord agrees to pay the broker a commission of 0.25% at closing, which shall be in addition to any commission in the event that the tenant buys the property or the landlord decides to sell the property. We can get an additional commission. And then rent account, the broker shall have the authority to provide each prospective tenant a copy of the lease approved by the landlord. Typically, a landlord is going to give you a lease that they want you to use. We do have a lease available. It does not always contain all the terms that a landlord wants. And so I always recommend that if you are going to enter into an exclusive right to lease agreement with a landlord, that you get a copy of their lease so you can provide that to a tenant or prospective tenant for them to take a look at. Protection period, the landlord agrees to pay the broker a commission within the 365 days after the expiration date in the event that a tenant that we show the property to decides to rent the property. Okay. Civil rights just talks about fair housing again. Marketing, this is going to give us the right to market the property, lines 98 through 104. We are going to put a sign possibly on the property. It depends. Talk to the landlord. They might not want a sign on the property, so you'll have to ask them. Lines 109 through 116. The landlord authorizes the broker to conduct and allow authorized brokers agents to show the property. So again, similar to what we do when we are listing a property for sale. The seller's cooperation, the landlord shall make the real estate available for showings. And that's important because sometimes a tenant might still be in a property and we have a hard time showing it. This is just saying, hey, we can't lease the property if we can't show the property typically. And then business arrangements disclosures and affiliated business arrangement disclosure has or has not been provided in conjunction with this contract. I can't think of any ABAs that would be. You're not going to use a title company for a lease, and so therefore there wouldn't be any ABAs that I'm aware of. So you would check has not. Agency disclosure. We still have to provide a consumer guide to agency to any prospective tenants. We also have to provide it to the landlord. And when you go to lease the property, you must use an agency disclosure form that explains that you represent the landlord and not the tenant. Okay. You could also be a dual agent if the tenant and landlord allow you to, though it's not recommended. You should only really represent a landlord and not have the tenant have any representation. Now, if they absolutely want representation, you can be a dual agent or refer it to another agent so that they can have representation. Indemnity by the seller, this is just protection for the brokerage and the agent. It just says that they recognize that the broker is relying on all the information that they have provided us. Disclosure, we are going to disclose any problems with the property that we might know. The seller doesn't have to fill out a disclosure, but of course, if there is something that they need to disclose, they can do that. And the broker is authorized to disclose non-confidential information pertaining to the real estate to all parties. But of course, you have to keep anything confidential that your seller or landlord asks you to. Sex offender registration, we've gone over that like we did in the other agreement, and that's really just if you have any information, supply it. If you don't, look on the sheriff's website. This is the sole contract on lines 148 through 150. The landlord's acknowledgement, 151 through 156. They just acknowledge that any questions regarding legal liability with regarding any provisions in the agreement, contact legal counsel themselves, but that they have received a copy of this. Arbitration, if there are any claims or issues that we will agree to, instead of arguing, we will go to arbitration rather than filing lawsuits against one another, and it will be in the county from Stark County. And that's pretty much it. So you're going to get the landlord's current address, the phone number, all the information on there. You're going to sign it. So I don't know if you guys have any questions. I went over that relatively quick, but it's a pretty straightforward document. And again, I just caution you not to list a property for lease if you don't know what you're doing or ask for help. All right, let's go over the buyer representation agreement then. Actually, I'm assuming the chats you're checking. Okay, perfect. Yep.
Hey, Rich.
Yes.
You need a lease agreement to lease a property then.
What do you mean?
I have a friend that was saying he was thinking about leasing out his property that he owns now instead of selling it and then buying another one. I didn't know anything about leasing until today.
Yep.
So he would need to work with an agent and write up one of these to be.
Well, he doesn't have to work with an agent. I mean, an owner doesn't have to work with an agent to lease their own property. They are allowed, but if they are entering into an agreement with, they must enter into an agreement with a licensed real estate agent to lease their property on the open market unless they are doing it themselves. Yes. The same thing is true for sale by owner. They can list their own property for sale anywhere they want and represent themselves. But if they're going to have somebody else represent them, it must be a licensee. Yep.
Do you have any good recommendations of agents here that could help us?
So our property management, I will say, division is the Daisy Lane Group. We have Christy Trentman with the Daisy Lane Group. They have about 500 doors that they manage, and they lease things out. Now, there are a few real estate companies in the area that exclusively only represent landlords and tenants, and they list properties. Typically, what we find is a lot of times agents don't list these leases in the MLS, or if they do, some of those companies don't want to share the listing with somebody else, and so they will never call you back if you want to show the property, unfortunately. So I would say, Christy has been great. She has a great reputation, her and her team. I would recommend that you talk to them about, if there's going to be a client of yours that you can recommend to her to lease a property. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, we'll go over the exclusive buyer representation agreement. It's 11:56. I don't know if we probably only did an hour for the class or maybe an hour and a half.
We did an hour and a half.
An hour and a half, so I'll try and get you guys out of here a little bit early. Once we get finished with this. All right, so our buyer representation agreement, this is exclusive to Keller Williams Legacy Group. Everybody's buyer's representation agreements can be different. There are 8 things that you have to have in a buyer representation agreement. The first of which is the equal housing and opportunity language and logo that has to be on there. So you'll see that we have that prominently at the top. And then you also have to have a beginning date and an end date. So I get a lot of times a question, well, Rich, I just want to show this property, this one listing to this person. That's all. I want to put an address in there. That's fine. You can put an address on this document, but you also have to have a beginning date and an end date for the agreement. I don't really recommend writing in an address. And the reason I say that is because if a buyer says to you, I only want to look at this house, I only want you to show me this house, and I'm only comfortable signing an agreement with you for this house, I would say, that's fine. I understand that. I hope that you will want to work with me in the future once you see what a great job that I do, even on this first showing. However, I am required to have you sign a consumer guide and the buyer representation agreement. How about we make this good for 48 hours? So I'm going to put a date in here of today. And it will expire at midnight on the 14th. So we're only going to have you for 2 days. Does that work for you? And by the way, when we get down a little bit further in here, you can actually, there's a way for you to get out of this agreement if you don't want me for the full 48 hours. So that's how I would handle it if somebody says, I want this to be property specific. I'm not going to make it property specific, but I will make it 1 day or 2 days or whatever you might want. Okay. Now, hopefully you can get them to sign an agreement for 3-4 months with you, 6 months. I have seen some agents doing a year. I do not recommend a year, and I will tell you as your broker, it's very, very difficult for me not to allow a client to get out of an agreement when they just first meet you. You get them to sign a 1-year agreement. They call me 3 weeks later. They don't like you. They don't want to work with you. They want to go work with another person, and I'm going to try and support you and not let them out of the agreement. And it's going to be for an entire year. It's impossible to please both parties. I can't please you as my agent or our agent at Keller Williams, and I can't please the client because you're going to not want me to let them out of the agreement, and yet they want out of the agreement. So I'm going to make somebody angry. So I really just say to you, if you have to strong arm somebody into signing a 1-year agreement with you and they don't want to work with you, I think that's a problem. Sign a 3-month agreement. If they like you, they're going to sign another agreement with you, an extension thereof. So that's just my little soapbox there. And then you'll get the client to initial on line 7, whether they have or are, whether they have signed in another exclusive representation agreement with another brokerage. Now, buyers can be liars, right? They might initial this and you think, oh, I got a new buyer and they've signed one of these with every company, okay? What I will preface here is we are not going to be the first real estate company to sue a buyer for them not buying a house with us, okay? Because that would damage all 12 agents that we have within the Keller Williams legacy brokerage, but could damage all of the Keller Williams credibility throughout the state and or the nation, because the headlines would read something like, you know, Keller Williams is suing a client for not buying a house with them, right? Even though we are even though we have the right to do that, we wouldn't do that because it would be terrible for business. So the reason that we're getting people to sign exclusive buyer representation agreements is because we could hold the buyer to that and sue them. Again, no brokerage has that I'm aware of yet. But also, you as a licensed real estate agent can't cross signs. What that means is if a buyer comes to you and says, I signed an exclusive right or an exclusive representation agreement with another brokerage, you should not be working with that client to help them get out of that agreement to get your agreement signed. That would be crossing signs, just like with a listing agreement. You cannot call a seller and say, I know you're listed with XYZ company, but come with me and I'll be your realtor. So it would be the same thing. If you know a client has already signed a representation agreement, you need to tell them, I would love to work with you. You need to contact the broker that had you sign that agreement and try and get out of it. I cannot assist you in getting out of it. I know you don't want to say that, but that's what you have to say. All right. And then assistance to the buyer, you can explain to them all the things that you're going to do for them, what the buyer's duties are. They're going to call you, whether they go to an open house, whether they see a house online, no matter what, they need to call you. This is a great way for you to educate your clients so they don't go rogue and call somebody else. All of these things that are in this agreement will strike a conversation and an explanation for you and your client. Okay. And then property condition, this is again, a conversation that says that we are not home inspectors, that you understand that you're purchasing a property in its as is present physical condition. You have the right to do inspections, but we are not inspectors as licensed real estate agents. You may conduct a different home inspection or any other inspection, and we'll help and walk you through that. But we are here for helping you evaluate the property, not necessarily evaluating the condition of the property, it's the value. And then professional service providers, we can give a list of home inspectors, title companies, radon inspectors, anything like that. But anybody that's licensed within the state of Ohio, we can give you that list, but you do not have to use any of those people. You can use anybody you want for an engineering or survey or title or legal services or home inspectors. We're going to recommend these folks to you. These are people that we like to work with, but you're not obligated to use them. Seller disclosures in the state of Ohio, we know that we have the Ohio residential property disclosure form, and that should be applicable on almost every sale, but there are 7 exemptions. You can see those 7 exemptions on the exemption form, but it just lets the seller know that, the buyer know that there is an Ohio property disclosure form, and hopefully you'll be able to provide them with one. And the buyer needs to rely on that information in order to decide whether they want to purchase property. Excuse me. Home warranty, we can't offer a home warranty. The seller can pay for it, the buyer can pay for it. You will offer that to your client. Our compensation, again, is not set by law. It is 100% negotiable. And this is where you've got to get very good if you're not already at negotiating and showing your value as the agent. So in consideration for its time, services, and advocacy, you agree to pay Legacy Group a commission of, you can put a blank fee there if it's a flat fee, but typically we would see the $295 fee there, and blank percent. So I am always going to put 3% in my agreement. The reason I'm going to put 3% in my agreement is because I choose not to work for less than 3% if I can help it. Now, if you put in there 1% because it's somebody like, oh, geez, I can't negotiate 3%. They don't want to pay 2.5%, but I'll take 1%. Whatever you put on line 64, you cannot get paid more than that. And I can't say that enough. You cannot get paid more than that. You can't cancel this agreement, do a new agreement to get paid more. You can't amend this agreement to get paid more. If a seller is offering 2.5% and you put 1% or 2% in there, you cannot get paid the 2.5% from the seller. You're going to ask the question, well, what happens to that other 0.5%? The seller gets to keep it. Or maybe you can negotiate it to be used for your buyer's closing costs, but you cannot get paid more than what is in that box. So I always recommend to you that you put 3% in there or 2.5%, whatever it is that you are willing to accept. So those first 2 boxes should always have a flat fee of the $295, or if you're on a team, maybe it's $395, $495, whatever that would be, and then your percentage that you are working for. I do not recommend that you are filling out the next blank on line 64. It says if left blank, it's not applicable. The reason that I say that to you is because if you put in there, I'm willing to work for a minimum of $3,500, this is what I envision happening to you. I've not had it happen to me yet because I have not filled out that box, but I envision if I were a buyer and I got into a heated negotiation with a seller over a price, I might come back to this document and say, geez, Ashley, you said on line 64 that you would work for a minimum of $3,500. I'm asking you to work for that minimum of $3,500 because I need the seller to accept my offer of $210,000. You might argue and say you're not willing to do that, but you put it in writing. It says that you are willing to. I do not recommend doing that. So that's why it says if left blank, it's not applicable. That means that the first 2 boxes on line 64, that's what you're working for. Okay. Line 67 through 69, we've only had 1 agent that I'm aware of so far accept or ask for a retainer fee in order to work with a buyer. Now, I hope that one day we get to a point where every brokerage is asking for a retainer fee from a client, whether it's $500, $1,000, $3,000. I hope that we in real estate get to a point where we are getting paid for all of the work that we do. And I say that simply because you in your career, you're going to have client or prospective client call you from the state of California or Maine or wherever, and they're gonna say, I'm an investor and I know that it's great to buy a house in Ohio because your prices are lower, and I would like you to go do 3 video tours of these 3 properties within the state, and I may or may not be buying something in Cleveland or Canton or Akron. I may buy something in Columbus or Cincinnati. Well, you only get paid if you sell something, right? So I might say to that investor, I would love to work with you, but my time is not free. And so therefore, I'm going to charge you a $1,000 retainer fee because I am happy to go and video all 3 of those houses. But since there's no guarantee that you're going to buy a property from me in an area in which I service, I still want to be paid for my time. I'm going to charge you $1,000 if you buy something with me during the time of this agreement. I'm going to credit that $1,000 to the commission that I am getting paid either by the seller or from you. If you don't buy something from me in this time frame, that $1,000 gets paid to our brokerage. Now, on the brokerage level, we're giving that money to you. It's going to be subject to your regular split, right? Because that is what you procure. We want to make sure you're getting paid for the time and value and effort that you're putting into a property. But I've only had 1 agent do that so far, and we're still holding it. So we'll see how that goes. But that's what that is for, and that's why we put it in there, because that's what I envision. Okay. All right. Protection period. It just says that you shall also pay legacy group compensation in the event that you acquire a property within 30 days of the date of the parties of the written termination of this agreement. So we have that in there because what is happening, or what I've seen happen, is that a buyer that has been working with you will call you up and say, you know what, I want to get out of this agreement. And you say, okay, great, I release you from the agreement, no problem. And then they go out and they buy the listing that you had already sent them, and they buy it from the listing agent because they don't have to pay the listing agent compensation. It's in here for you to use this as a tool to tell your buyer, we will come after you if you buy a house within 30 days after the termination of this agreement that we have physically shown you. That we have shown you. Because it is happening. We have had plenty of buyers that will call us, and all of a sudden they say they don't want to buy that house and they don't want to work with you anymore, and then they go to the listing agent and buy the house that you just showed them. Now, I will say, again, we are not going to be the first brokerage to sue a client, but use this to your advantage. You want to instill some fear in them that Keller Williams Legacy Group is going to sue them in the event that they do this, and or that they're going to owe us and they're going to owe the other company, right? So that is why that's in there. And then the termination of this, we have a blank number of days in here so that it does help protect you. If you use this document the way it was envisioned, it will protect you so that what I just explained to you doesn't happen. So if I say in here, I'm not going to put anything less than 10 days. That's just my personal preference. I have seen agents put 1 day in there. I've seen agents put 30 days in there. I've seen agents put 5 days in there. On mine, I put 10 days in there. And the reason I say that is because if I go show a property to a buyer, and all of a sudden they want to terminate the agreement, they have to give me 10 days advance written notice. Typically, a house is not going to be on the market that they want to see for 10 days after we've seen it together. Not always, market times are getting longer, but what we've seen in the past, this way they can't run and go call the listing agent and say, oh, I want to buy the house with you now, right? That's why I have that in there. Yes.
Does it extend the original 30 days? Protection period?
It doesn't. Well, it won't, no. It will not extend the original 30 days, but what it does is it gives 10 days that you have to terminate the agreement. So then that termination date in 10 days, you have 30 days from that date.
So
it doesn't,
technically it extends it.
I guess if you look at it as an extension, yes, but it depends on what the original date was. It may not feel like an extension because maybe you had 6 months left on the agreement,
So
right?
Billy Bob tells you he wants out of the agreement, he has to wait 10 days to get out of it.
Mhm.
And then he goes and buys that house within that 30-day time frame, you're owed a commission.
You are owed a commission. I cannot promise you that you're going to get the commission, like I said, because we are not going to be the first brokerage to sue that consumer. Now, what I will tell you is I will happily call the other brokerage and I will say, you know that we have an exclusive buyer's representation agreement. Did you ask the consumer if they were already working with an agent or not? And we will press them on whether or not they have the right documents signed. And if we have to file a complaint to find out, we will. I'll do whatever I can to make sure that you guys get paid, but I'm not going to promise that we're going to sue a buyer. Yeah. All right, confidentiality again. This is just, keep the information that your buyer is requesting for you to keep confidential, keep it confidential. Agency, this just explains the consumer guide and how agency works in the state of Ohio. Consent to delegation, this gives us the right, which is really important, that gives us as the brokerage the right to delegate another agent within the brokerage. And I say that because even though you may not feel supported, if I get a client that calls me and says, I don't want to work with Rich anymore, my first goal is to try and get you paid. So I'm going to say, okay, great, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, I'm going to assign you another agent within the brokerage, and I'm going to give you Kurt's name or whatever, whoever's name. Before I do that, though, I'm going to call Kurt and I'm going to say, Kurt, I have a buyer that was working with Ashley or Rich. The buyer doesn't want to work with us anymore. I want to give them to you, but in lieu of giving them to you, I'm going to ask you to pay a 25% referral to our other agent, because this buyer could just leave our brokerage altogether and not give you the opportunity to make 25% as the first buyer's agent. Now, as the first buyer's agent, you might be angry at me because I'm only getting a 25% or a 30% referral or whatever. I'm going to try and get you paid is my point. I'm going to do everything I can to try and keep it in-house and get you paid. I hope that you feel supported by me doing that, but you may not feel supported. You may be like, no, I'm angry because I want 50% or I don't like the agent you're giving them to. Well, unfortunately, again, I could just say, well, the buyer isn't going to work with us at all. They're going to go to another brokerage. And since we're not going to sue that other brokerage and we're not going to sue the consumer, you get nothing. Right? So that is why we have this consent to delegation in there, is to really try and protect you and to try and get you paid. Then we have the fair housing disclosure. Again, this is the same in all of our documents. It's federal law and state law that we have that in there. Cybersecurity, again, just protecting the consumer, letting them know that we will never ask them for certain information about their personal data. And other potential buyers, we are working with other potential buyers on lines 114 through 120. In the event that a buyer wants to make an offer, two buyers want to make an offer on the same property, we are going to let you know that we have already written an offer on that property if we have. And it does happen. And with that, it's called a contemporaneous offer, and we have a notice in .loop that you can provide to the second buyer. So let's say, for example, that I have buyer A and B that I'm working with. I have buyer A and B that I show the same property to. Buyer A writes an offer on that property. I have no duty to disclose to buyer A that I've shown that property to buyer B. But buyer A writes an offer on it. I now know what buyer A wrote because I wrote the offer for them. Buyer B comes all along and says, you know what, Rich? I too want to make an offer on that property. That buyer B, is the one that I have to give the notice of contemporaneous offers to and ask them to sign, giving me permission to represent them in the transaction and write an offer for them, because I already know the terms that buyer A wrote. And I cannot tell buyer B or buyer A what those terms are. So buyer B might say to me, you know what, Rich, you already wrote an offer and you can't tell me what it is. I don't feel like you're working for me anymore. I want another agent. Then again, comes in the delegation, we can give another agent and hopefully get you paid a referral for the work that you've done. That is pretty much it with these agreements. I don't have anything else to add other than to say to you that you need to sign on line 138 to make this valid. If you don't sign it and the buyer doesn't sign it, it is not valid. Just because the buyer signs it doesn't mean it's valid if you don't sign it. Okay, so please make sure you're signing your documents. Any questions on the buyer representation?
Can you scroll all the way down and explain the amendment?
Yes. So the amendment you'll see is page 5. And typically, we don't see anybody using amendments. I say to you, you cannot amend an agreement to get paid more money. You cannot do that. But what I would envision this for is, let's say, for example, because this is called an exclusive buyer representation agreement. Let's say, for example, that a client all of a sudden says, you know what, I was getting relocated to Akron and I was happy to work with you. But now my employer's also open this up that I might get sent to Columbus or Cincinnati. I can't exclusively work with you because, Rich, you don't know anything about Cincinnati or the Columbus market. So then I might put on here, this agreement, this exclusive agreement is amended to Stark and Summit County only, or something like that. It's very possible that I might say to the client that I am able to go to Mansfield or Worcester or wherever, but I'm not going to Columbus. So it just depends. That's what we would envision the amendment for. is a location. Any other questions? Okay. Nothing on Zoom either, unless you guys have questions. All right. So I'm gonna let you out 15, 14 minutes early. I appreciate your time and everybody being here. Thanks for paying attention. Have a good day.